Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode. It is not an episode of the Best Games Period. Instead, this is an episode of Honorable Mention, which is a sub-show of the Best Games Period, where rather than having a lively discussion, I, or sometimes Naomi, monologue into a microphone about a game that we like a lot, but maybe don't necessarily consider one of the best games of all time. And so this week, maybe we don't consider it one of the best games of all time, but still believe deserves recognition, and you should definitely check out if you have the time, money, all of that stuff, if the opportunity presents itself or this sounds interesting. And to that end, this week, I wanted to talk about a game that is near and dear to my heart, but in typical fashion for its developer is, I think, relatively difficult to parse, and that is Pyre. Pyre released in 2017. It's from Supergiant Games, designed by Greg Kasavin and Amir Rao, and you might be familiar with their work from Transistor and Bastion. Those are kind of their two previous games that are really noteworthy. And it is... How to describe Pyre? In my review of it, which you can read on community.extra-life.org, I compared it to NBA Jam. It is a top-down-ish, and this is kind of the difficulty. It's basically a sports game. The main significant ways that you interact with the game consist of traveling around an overworld and making RPG-like decisions, and that is followed up by periodic moments of participating in this in-world sporting tournament called the Rights. And the Rights are actually more religious in significance. They're really important, and we'll come back around to that in a bit. But essentially, those Rights play like NBA Jam. It's like a sports game where the goal is to put the ball in your opponent's goal. And in this case, every time you score score an amount of points, that essentially decreases your opponent's life meter. And if you're able to extinguish their pyre before they can extinguish yours, then you win. Pretty simple. However, each of your characters, and usually the enemy characters or the opposing team, have access to a wide array of abilities, depending on who they are and what their specialties are. And so I wanted to talk about this, not specifically because of the gameplay, which I really like. The gameplay is incredibly solid. It's fun. It's fast-paced. I wish that there was more support for it. It feels like one of those games that would be really fun to play as a kid, like inviting friends over and playing some Pyre. Part of the problem is I don't know that the game necessarily presents itself in a way that is conducive to that sort of play. But that being said, I think it's really fun from the few times I have been able to play it multiplayer with other people. I guess what I'm getting at is that all that's cool, all that's great. The RPG progression system is interesting. Basically, every time you win, the characters who have participated in the Rights gain enlightenment, which they can use to unlock more potent abilities and stuff that shakes up the game. And I do really think that those abilities and the creative way that they thought to augment the rules in Pyre, it's really cool. It's interesting and fun and engaging. So if that alone is enough to get your attention, you should definitely check out Pyre. I think what's more interesting to me, however, is the story and world building and cast of characters in Pyre that are all brought to life by Gen Z, who's like one of the best and most talented artists working in video games. She's worked on the art for pretty much all of Supergiant Games titles, and like I have two art prints of hers on my wall. They're absolutely gorgeous. That being said, part of the experience of playing Pyre is being introduced to this very colorful cast of characters that all have their own motivations and interesting quirks and like ways of speaking and their own unique cultures and histories and all of this. Because essentially Pyre takes place in a sort of purgatory. It is this alternate world that people are banished to from the main world, from the real world. It is called the Downside, and people are banished there to kind of come face to face with their sins, with their failings. And like, one of the interesting things about that is we get to see this segment of society that has been defined as what the real world society is not. And so we have this cross-section that we can kind of use to construct, like mentally construct what the world of Pyre, like the real world of Pyre, actually looks like. And the game consists of giving out these little pieces that slowly fits it all together. And it's really interesting and really cool. Like, you learn that there are these weird fish eel creatures and a race of harpy women that make up the entirety of this international conflict that's currently raging in the real world between the main cities of I forget exactly what it's called, but like the main political force in the real world, which is held together by this religious order and that kind of controls who gets exiled to the Downside. And so you have different creatures. You have like these weird ogre minotaur people who are just so cool looking. You have normal humans. You have these Medusa-like bog witches who are really interesting. You have talking dog people who are, I love them. Rookie Greentail is amazing. So you have all of this, and they're embodied by these different characters who all come together to be basically a part of your team, your team for the rights, your triumvirate. And so, I should mention, only 3 people from any given group can participate in the rights. So only a very limited number of people can actually play, and so that means inevitably someone in your roster is not going to reach the full extent of their capabilities. You might not see the full extent of, you know, who that character is, which is meant to encourage replay and experimentation, which is cool, because there are a lot of very pivotal decisions to be made throughout Pyre. And to give a little bit more context to the Downside and the Purgatory Downside, there are these tiny pockets of individuals. First off, it's very hard to actually live in the Downside. It's rough and dangerous and deadly, and at the very beginning of the game, the protagonist, the main character here, is on the verge of death, is very nearly about to die before getting picked up by these 3 enigmatic figures. And that kind of leads to getting roped into these rites, which are a secretive religious rite, I suppose, that is kind of meant to purify the participants. And so whoever is able, whichever team is able to win their rights and make it all the way to the top, where you literally have to climb a mountain, and there's a crazy ruins, and participate in one final rite. And the winner of that rite is then able to choose someone from their team to escape the downside and re-enter the real world, absolved of all their crimes. And so that leads to a really interesting predicament, because you can kind of see where this is going. Not everyone is going to be able to leave the downside and go back to the real world. And so a large part of the drama in Pyre comes from, who are you going to pick? Do you send your most valuable player off back to the real world? Because once you do, you are not going to see them again for the rest of the game. They are, for all intents and purposes, back in the real world, and you can kind of ascertain, maybe from conversations beforehand, what they might do when they get there, and all of those plans, but you don't know. And I think that is a really, really cool and interesting element. One of the themes that Greg, I never know how to say his name correctly, so I'm sorry, Greg, if you ever listen to this. Greg Kasavin sounds right. Has said it, like, one of the main themes of this game is continuing on despite loss, experiencing failures and moving forward. And I think that's built into the game in 2 interesting ways. The first way is, obviously, you can lose to these teams. You can fail in your attempt to pass through the rites. And that means that other teams might send their leaders, and you have to soldier on, and that can be a devastating blow to your team, the Nightwings. But that's how real life works. Like, the sport season doesn't end because you lost one of the most important games. It continues on. And the other way is, even if you win, you still experience some degree of loss because you no longer have access to that player. And usually by the time you have reached the end of one of these seasons, at the very least, one of your players is at that maximum level of enlightenment, and you know their story, you know why they came to the downside, why, like, what got them sent there in the first place, and you feel for them. Each of them has, like, this really interesting and moving backstory, and it's heartbreaking to know, A, that you're going to lose one of the people you've spent the most time with and have grown to care about, and also one of your most powerful players. And that eventually begins forcing you to adopt new and different strategies in the rights themselves, because you no longer have those powerful players that were the linchpins of your old strategy. And you can't keep using that old strategy with these players. And I guess I should get into this a little bit more. But as you travel the world, you're able to make these little decisions, and sometimes they're big decisions. And these decisions, depending on what you decide, I'm saying decisions and decide way too much here in, like, the last minute, but bear with me. Depending on what you do in the game, that determines the dispositions of each of your players. And just like in real life, if a player is depressed, they are not going to perform at 100%. If a player has food poisoning, they're not going to perform at 100%. There are going to be different consequences for your actions because the players, the members of your team who are going to be participating in the rites are... The game wants you to view them as real people, not just mechanical pawns. And so I love how humanizing that is, because you spend a lot of time with all of these characters. My one playthrough of Pyre took me 17 hours, and, well, probably more like 15 hours. And it was a really, really good time. But 15 hours is a lot of investment to put into a game, and I genuinely really cared about all of these characters. Rookie Greentail, the weird vagabond girl who keeps giving you different names every time it comes up. Sir Gilman, the kind of quixotic knight, who just wants to get back and help the people he had to leave behind to keep a hold of his honor. Then there's Hedwyn, who's like this really gregarious nomad, and you don't really know what his deal is. Or Jodariel, who's like a really hot buff lady, but is also kind of like both the security and mother figure of the group and has been in the downside longer than anybody, and perhaps more than anyone else deserves a chance to get free, because it is this hard existence that you aren't necessarily able to free everyone of. Or there's... And then later on top of this is all of the political motivations that we are able to read into the game as it develops. And so, like, for example, I mentioned that there is a conflict between the Harpies, or the Harps, and the main city-state of up in the real world. I forget exactly what it's called. But... later on in the game, you meet Pamitha, and Pamitha is a harp, and that presents an interesting and conflicting dilemma. Do you kind of renege on maybe some of your promises that you've made to other members of your team as to who's going to go free, and free Pamitha because you decide she's very useful and you grow close to her after knowing her story? Or what decision do you make, I guess? And that's, to me, the most interesting aspect of Pyre. The way that knowledge and the strengthening of relationships can really alter what choices you make, because from the beginning it might seem like a no-brainer. Well, yeah, obviously I have to free Hedwyn because he's nice and he saved my life, and he seems like a genuinely good person. But as you progress, there's a lot of other people in your team who are genuinely good people who might, not at first appear to be good, who might be better or more worthy picks. And it's just such a cool dynamic that I've never seen anything else try. Because it is a big narrative risk to put into your game the element of loss, because no one really likes losing. And losing is almost an inevitable part of Pyre. Which isn't to say that you will lose the games themselves. In fact, that's one of the most common criticisms. It's a criticism I myself had of Pyre, is that the actual gameplay itself isn't necessarily as punishing as the themes might seem to demand of it. Like, I maybe lost one game, like one of my rights, in an entire playthrough. And granted, there was a lot of like touch and go moments, a lot of tension. I'm not saying it wasn't fun to play, just that there weren't any times where I felt incredibly outclassed, or like there was a team that was just going to wreck me, or, you know, it was much more, my concern was much more on the relationships and the dynamics between characters, and like how things might change if I sent one character and not the other. Those were the things that I was juggling throughout my time with Pyre. And that, of course, the gameplay element, of course, shifts when you make it a human versus human game, where obviously humans are much smarter and better able to think on the fly than CPUs. But I wish there was a little bit more challenge there, to kind of hit that element of loss from both sides, because it leaves it up to the narrative to really pull that weight. And I think really that comes down to what I said earlier. No one likes to lose, and if you make the gameplay too difficult, that's going to lock a lot of people into that feeling of that frustration of loss, which isn't necessarily, you know, it's not conducive to getting people to continue playing your game. It's very tricky. That being said, I think Pyre pulls it off really, really well. I was very engaged with the narrative from the beginning to the end. I loved all of the characters, with maybe like the exception of like one or two that I just didn't find quite as interesting as everyone else. And I haven't even brought up this element. So the team that you end up joining for Pyre is called the Nightwings, and the Nightwings are like this legend among legends. So not a ton of people in the downside actually know that the rights are a thing. They just kind of accept their lot in life. They try and live on as long as possible, as comfortably as possible, and eke out some kind of existence. However, a select few stumble upon the rights, and the rights enable them to enter this sporting conflict to try and purify themselves and return to the world again. The founder or de facto leader of the Nightwings is this mysterious figure named Sandalwood, who is a tree person and amazing. But Sandalwood has something called the Plan. And like a lot of things in Pyre, it's not immediately explained what the plan is or what the significance of the plan is. And so you're left to kind of piece that together until it's like much more plainly laid out. And essentially, Sandalwood is a character who is exiled to the downside because he was printing like pamphlets or brochures that were speaking out against the government. And the government obviously didn't take too kindly to that and exiled him to the downside. However, he's been able to maintain connections with people in the real world using these creatures called imps, who are the only ones able to traverse from the real world to the downside and back and forth. And his plan is essentially to instigate some sort of revolution. And how that revolution goes largely depends on who you send back to the downside, from the downside. And so there is that element too that you have to take into account. It's not just who's worthy, who essentially deserves to go free, but also, you have to kind of figure out how you feel about the rites themselves. Like, should they come to an end? Should this practice be continued? What does the revolution look like? Is it going to be a violent one? Is it going to be peaceful? Is it like what sort of resolution to this plan do you want to work towards? And I think that's really another area where this game shines, because it doesn't outright tell you what to do. You are given the option at every step along the way of following this plan to not follow it. And so there might be moments where you disagree with what Sandalwood has in mind for his revolution. You might disagree with, maybe the worthiness of one of your companions to escape this hellish existence outweighs the necessity or the plan demands go free. And maybe that has some consequences on how the revolution winds up. And that, I think, is just so cool. Ultimately, I think one of the things that holds back Pyre from really reaching a best games period situation is I wanted more. I wanted more, and that I don't feel like it's unfair for me to say that I wanted more resolution to what was happening with the people who I sent away. And you don't really get that resolution. It kind of, like I said, those players that you send back, they're gone. And you kind of have to take it as given that they are doing what they say they are going to do. And you do eventually get some sort of brief resolution to how the revolution went and who's doing what and how things have turned out, but it wasn't really... I think that could have been fleshed out more. I think what I'm getting at is that this game is absolutely brilliant, but its narrative and the way the overall story unfolds is largely relegated to the background, and we aren't super connected with it except through these characters. And like, I love the characters to death, and I think that the focus on them was probably right for this project. However, I think that comes with a cost, and the cost is that we get progressively more disconnected from the background story of Pyre and like what's going on back in the city-state, which I just remembered is the Commonwealth. It's something that puts the player in a more, instead of being proactive about like kind of what's going on in the story, the player is almost more in a reactionary position, which isn't necessarily bad. It's just that it's another level of disconnect from the overall narrative. So, because again, like we start off the game from a place of not really knowing anything. We're just reacting to new information as it comes. And it would have been nice, I think, if after we began sending players back to the Commonwealth from the downside, the game shifted between what's happening in the Commonwealth and what's happening in the downside. And maybe the Commonwealth doesn't have those sections of gameplay where we're participating in the rites, but there seems like there would be a lot of really important decisions to be made on the other side. And I just think that would have ultimately upped the stakes for what's happening in the revolution. I think it would have been able to give more context to what's happening in the downside as the world events down there begin to ramp up. And I think that this is a game that needed just that little bit extra gameplay scope. And I realized that I'm like asking for significantly more game here, but I think that that's what I mean when I say that I wanted more. Like, I wanted to have that additional context, and maybe that is just too much from a writing perspective, and obviously outside of their budget and all of that. But I think it would have made the end product maybe more, I guess, feel like it has a stronger resolution, because we understand what's going on both sides, as opposed to having to interpret kind of vague signs and vague messages from the people who have gone up to the Commonwealth. And so I guess that's just where I am. I adore so much about Pyre, and I just think there was a big missed opportunity to make this something that resonated with people to a much stronger degree. Because I think a lot of people, when they think of Supergiant Games, they think of Transistor and they think of Bastion, but I feel like Pyre didn't necessarily find its full footing with a fan base. And I think largely that disconnect between what's going on that I was talking about just now, I think that might have been able to bridge that. I'm wording very badly right now, but I think it would have been able to provide more of a conclusion, be able to kind of give more context to what's going on, and provide some really interesting consequences for your choices, aside from, oh, they're just not around anymore. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm at. And I should mention the music in Pyre. It's good. I love everything about this game's style and its sound, and the writing is fantastic. Each of these characters like pops out of the screen and just comes alive. I love them all so much, and I don't know. I hope that I get to see more of these characters at some point. Maybe in a sequel, maybe in some other sort of project. There are very few games or really pieces of media in general that have made me want to write fan fiction. Pyre is definitely one of those where I would have loved to like sit down and like type out a story starring some of these characters. They're just so good. With that being said, thank you for taking the time to listen. Next week, I'm pretty excited. Fingers crossed, Naomi might be back. Right now, we are planning to record an episode on Don't Starve. So get ready for that. And before I end the show, make sure you check out Extra Life. And if you don't know what that is, it is a fantastic charity, part of Children's Miracle Network Hospitals. And basically, people from across the United States and Canada can come together and play games to raise money for sick and injured kids in hospitals. And when you sign up over at extra-life.org, you can actually choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital you want to support, and 100% of everything you raise goes directly to that hospital to help sick and injured kids. It's really fantastic. Please check it out. Again, that's extra-life.org. And if you want to find this podcast, we are on iTunes, Libsyn, SoundCloud. We're also on the Extra Life community site, community.extra-life.org. I will also mention that Extra Life Tabletop Appreciation Weekend is coming up. It is August 24th through the 25th. And you might have noticed on this podcast that occasionally we do a thing called Dragon Guard, which is a fun tabletop adventure. And that will be concluding on this year's Tabletop Appreciation Weekend, again, August 24th through the 25th. You can learn more about that over on the community site, community.extra-life.org. And to top it off, if you enjoy this show, if you enjoy listening to the sounds of my voice and other people's voices and Naomi's voice, please support us because, gosh golly, we need it to keep going and pay all the monies that it takes to actually run a podcast and have decent equipment, and maybe one day be in some way compensated for putting this together every week. So if you would like to support us in that way, patreon.com/bestgamesperiod. We'd really appreciate it. And also, if you really pledge any amount to us every month, and you get access to a bunch of unique shows that you can't listen to anywhere else. So, highly recommend that if you like this podcast. And with that being said, see you next time on the Flippity Dippity.